What happens when a group of dedicated professionals band together to change the face of publishing from the inside? You're about to find out on this episode of Disruptor.
From the edges of publishing, it's Disruptor, celebrating the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing industry and encouraging each of you to disrupt in your own way. Now here's your host, John Bard.
Greetings, one and all. I'm John Bard. Welcome to Disruptor, Episode 6, with Joanna Cardenas, book editor and member of Latinx in publishing. I've been in the publishing world for close to 30 years, and I've seen a lot of things change, but maybe they haven't changed fast enough. And so I asked the question, are there disruptors out there? Are there people and companies that are really changing things in publishing, pushing us into the future, throwing out the old rule book and creating a new one all their own? I went in search of that, and I found them. And every week here on Disruptor, you'll meet them. Welcome to the journey. It's time to disrupt. Today's episode of Disruptor is brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book. As an editor, Joanna Cardenas has worked on some wonderful books, such as The First Rule of Punk by Celia C. Perez and The Epic Fail of Arturo Zamora by Pablo Cartea. Now she's involved in two very exciting projects. She's an editor at Penguin's new imprint, Kokila, which is bringing marginalized voices to the publishing world. And she's part of Latinx in publishing, an organization dedicated to bringing more Latino voices into the decision-making process inside publishing houses. I spoke to Joanna from her New York office. Welcome, Joanna Cardenas, to Disruptor. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's begin with the first question that I like to ask all of my guests. We are here to celebrate the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing industry. And Joanna, which one of those words best fits you?
So I think that probably some people in like my inner circle, some of my friends in my personal life would lovingly refer to me as a weirdo. But I think that for these purposes and talking about like the work that I do in the publishing industry, I actually like the term disruptor. I feel like that's pretty apt if I'm going to sort of choose a descriptor or a label. I'm someone who's passionate about moving the industry forward and making it accurately reflect the world that we live in, and just sort of, doing the good work alongside a lot of other people who are doing the good work. So whether or not a label fits, not super concerned about that, more concerned about just, getting the work done.
So let's talk about that work. And let's first, because we'll talk about your work individually as an editor, but let's talk about the group, Latinx in publishing. Tell us about how that group came to be and what it's attempting to accomplish.
Right. So formally, I feel like we're trying to both increase the number of Latinx people working in the industry, and also we aim to support Latinx creators, authors, and illustrators in their careers as they sort of join the publishing industry. And I think that we first started as a very informal sort of support group and network where we just sort of found each other in the industry, decided to get in a room together, talk about things that really affected our communities, and also check in with each other, support each other in the work that we're doing, and found that to be incredibly valuable. And we thought, it must be valuable if we sort of extend this out and reach our colleagues, both based in New York City, but also across the country who are working in various aspects of the publishing industry, that it must be valuable to them too. So we decided to sort of become a little bit more formal in that. We pursued our nonprofit status last year and were able to secure that. So now really our mission is to sort of address some of the data that we've been confronted with. I mean, anecdotally, I think we can all sort of agree that the publishing industry is fairly homogenous, but there have been studies out recently. Lee and Low, an independent publisher, did a study both about the children's book market and the books being published, but also the employees working at the various publishing houses producing this work. And on both fronts found that representation both on the page, with the creators creating the content, and also behind the scenes, people working in the industry to put these books out in the world, the representation just isn't there. So we're one of many organizations that has sort of come up to really address some of this data.
Why do you think the representation hasn't been there? Is it, from my experience with the publishing world, is that it's filled with well-meaning people who want to do the right thing, and yet here the right thing hasn't quite been done. Why do you think there's that disconnect?
Yeah, I think that there are some pretty big systemic issues with the industry in terms of, where it's located. It's located in one of the most expensive cities to live in. Starting salaries for an editorial assistant, for instance, are very, very low, and it's really hard to make your way in this industry if you don't have support, whether that be like from your financial support from your family or some other type of support to help you really grow and thrive in the industry. And I think that there aren't really any systems in place to affect that really critical piece of it. And then once you get into the publishing industry, I think that Latinx in publishing is one of many groups trying to address retention issues and really trying to not only increase the numbers of underrepresented people working in the industry, but really provide a network for them to grow, to find mentorship that they might not be able to find, so that they can continue to advance in their career in the industry, because that is another piece of it. So I think it's, there are some systemic hurdles that I don't think the publishing industry has tried to address yet. And I think that that's a huge barrier to entry.
So in your case, working with Viking and having now involvement in the Kokila imprint, which, I'm going to ask you about that imprint in a second. Is this a case, do you think, of a company like Viking taking notice of some of what's happening at the ground level with organizations like Latinx in publishing, and making a response and making a really good faith effort to move forward? Are you starting to see publishers paying attention to these concerns and acting on it now?
I think that some of the organizations like Latinx in Publishing, like POC in Publishing, like We Need Diverse Books, have tried to make a real case. I mean, because, this is a business. And so I think that some of the in-house teams really respond to data, sales data, making sure that I think that those organizations, what they're trying to do is really sort of lay out the very clear case of untapped market potential. And I think that is one thing that the publishing industry is starting to respond to in certain ways. I think you can see this across other media with film and television, and I think that the hunger for stories from the margins is there, and people are showing up, and they're really supporting stories that are representing their communities. And I think that is definitely something that the publishing industry has taken notice of. On the hiring end, I can't really, I mean, I think that some of these organizations like Latinx in Publishing and POC and Pub, what we're trying to do is make it easier to connect with people from various communities outside of the traditional publishing programs that I think a lot of companies turn to when they're looking to hire new assistants. And I think that there is a willingness to partner with some of these organizations to make those connections that they wouldn't otherwise make.
One of the things that is a little bit tricky in this emerging environment, and something we deal with writers about quite a bit, is this notion of what is cultural appropriation? When is it acceptable for, say, a white writer to write about experiences beyond their own, and vice versa? And again, it's a lot of well-meaning people kind of tripping over each other. Sometimes it feels like in this. How do you feel about that? How do we create a standard that's where there's mutual respect, where authors of color, of different backgrounds are being heard, but we all can kind of share in the story?
Yeah, I think that, for creators who are not coming from marginalized communities but want to sort of tell those stories as well, I think sometimes the instinct is like, I want to help, I want to make a difference, this is how I know how to do that. I think the thing to keep in mind is there are many different ways to affect change, and there are many different ways to contribute to movements that don't necessarily involve centering yourself or your stories. I think that one of the many ways, like backing authors from marginalized backgrounds, buying their books, promoting them online, helping to signal boost, and making sure that we sort of uplift their voices. I think that's one way to do it. That experience, it comes down to really doing the research and immersing yourself in a community, and making sure that you're talking to as many people as possible, that you're also doing the academic research that's necessary for something like that. I think a lot of people, they put a lot of work into, for instance, world building and fantasy, when really, like, even if you're telling a story about the world we live in, the concrete world that we all know, there is still a fair amount of research that needs to be done to create an authentic story that fully represents the community that you want to represent. So I think that, not being shy about doing the work, and also being open to feedback from those communities, and rather than taking the feedback defensively, really listening to, what communities are telling you and about how they want to be represented.
When you were growing up, did you feel like you had voices in publishing in terms of the books that were being presented to you that really spoke to you in your experience?
I feel like there are, and this is sort of the indication that I get from colleagues that I talk to who've been around in the publishing industry for a very long time, even when I myself was a reader in school, is that, there are cycles. And there was definitely, when I was coming up as a reader, an emergence of multicultural literature. And there were imprints like Gallo at HarperCollins, and a few others that were dedicated to bringing books from various communities to market. And so, like, I had authors like Gary Soto, who I definitely, I read his whole body of work. I feel like I also had some representation in media, like Selena Quintanilla was a huge presence in my early development, and just sort of seeing her succeed using her art to speak to her communities really made an impact on me. So I feel like in my childhood, I sort of grew up in a time where there were, I'm naming two out of like entire industries, the music industry and the book publishing industry. But I did have like those two really strong touchstones. And I think that's something that has really motivated me to join the industry, and to sort of make sure that subsequent generations have shelves worth of books that they can turn to when they have big questions that they need to parse and to help them sort of develop their inner compass.
Let's talk about the times we live in, because they're very unusual times, and very unusual times impact children greatly. Especially, I think about children in Mexican American families who are worried about what's going to happen to their parents, to kids in Puerto Rico who suddenly find their lives thrown upside down. Is this particularly an important time for the right voices to come out and speak to these young people?
Yeah, I think it was always the right time. I think, sure, certainly now there's an urgency to be able to, to make sure that kids can see themselves in story, because to see yourself in a story validates who you are as a person. It communicates to you that your story is important enough to be told, and that you have a place in the pantheon of literature and of stories that endure the course of time. So I think that has always been important, and kids have always needed that. I think right now, when we are faced with constant imagery and constant messaging that tells you otherwise, it's even more important. And messaging that's coming from the authority figures of our country. I think that, yes, it's always been important. And I think that right now, when there's so much messaging that is harmful to self and to the creation of self-identity, that we need this.
Is this something, now obviously Viking, having taken the step of creating that imprint, I think gets it, but from your experience, do people up the food chain in publishing, do they really understand the need, the absolute need right now to diversify and to provide voices, not just authors, but also editors, people along the entire publishing chain? Or are they just simply kind of running a little bit afraid, saying, we got to do this so we don't get heat? In other words, have they fully bought in, do you think?
I think there's a little bit of both of those things happening, depending on where you look. I want to clarify that Kokila is an imprint of Pen Young Readers, so it's not associated with Viking necessarily. It's an imprint just like Viking. But just to sort of use that as an example, my publisher, Namrata Tripathi, founded and runs this imprint to try to address the sort of three really big issues with respect to representation in a very thoughtful way. So the imprint is dedicated to centering stories from the margins. So that's addressing representation on the level of the stories that are told, but also in terms of the creators. And it's also, she was very intentional about the team that she put together, and the team is made up of 4 women of color. So it's addressing representation in the gatekeepers as well, and in the people who are behind the scenes working on the projects. And a big directive of the imprint is to, have the competency to edit cross-culturally, so that, we're learning as much as we can with every project. And so the imprint sort of addresses representation in terms of creators, in terms of stories, but also in terms of the gatekeepers, and really taking that responsibility seriously by doing, the research that's really involved in educating ourselves, because we also have blind spots. We're bringing to the table our personal experiences and our personal histories, but that has limits, and we recognize that. And we recognize that the job of a good editor is to always keep learning and always keep pushing ourselves, so that we know the right questions to ask, and we can truly honor the stories that are coming from various communities that we might be part of, and that also that we might not be part of. This approach to editing is something, and the imprint as a whole is something that was always supported by the president of Penguin Young Readers, which I think is a very important thing to note, who's Jen Loja here. And when Namrata came up with the idea to found the imprint, and when she pitched it to Jen Loja, there was nothing but support the entire way. And I think that that's going to be one of the really big fundamental pieces of all of this, is getting support from the top and making sure that there's not only support, but also a good understanding of why we're doing this.
Yeah. So in terms of Latinx, and let's move ahead. Let's look ahead, say 3 years, 5 years down the road. What would have happened for you guys to say, okay, things are really now moving in the right direction? What are some of the benchmarks or signals that you'd be looking for from the publishing industry to know that you're making a difference?
Yeah, I think we look to some of the studies that are starting to become a more regular part of the industry, which, like that Liam Moe study that found that while the instances of representation in characters in stories, has increased, the percentage of creators who are writing these stories and come from marginalized backgrounds has not gone up nearly as much as the representation that's happening on the page. So, until there's, some sort of balance there, we will continue to do the work that we do. I think that something that Latinx in Publishing hopes to become is sort of an industry leader, a thought leader in terms of specifically the Latinx community. We hope that publishers will one day use us as a resource and maybe turn to us first when they have questions, when they would like to understand our market a little bit better, because we do have the capacity to have that information ready for publishers when they need it.
What are some ways that our listeners can help support this? You mentioned a few earlier on, but just talk a little bit about the ways that, just because we're going to have people listening who are in the publishing world, we're going to have authors, we're going to have readers, booksellers, librarians. What are some ways that they can, on their own, make a difference?
Yeah, I think that right now there's so much happening just in the world in general that it's easy to feel overwhelmed and to feel like there's so much happening. Where do I even get started? Which I can relate to that. But I think that something that people often forget is that change can happen on a small scale and a local level that is still meaningful. So I think, you don't have to tackle all of the big picture issues at once. I think that finding the way that you can be helpful to your community is vital. Think of grassroots efforts and how successful they're able to become because of collaboration. I don't know, listen to those, or listen for those who are doing the work and join them. I think that's a great way to get started and to really help make change that starts at a local level but can really grow from there. Also, if you don't see a space for yourself, create one. I think that's how Latinx in Publishing got started, is we didn't see a support network for our community in this industry, so we created one. And now we've been able to affect change in a few different areas of the industry. So if something doesn't exist, create it. And I think that's something that should feel very intuitive to people who work in the publishing industry and this creative field in general.
Great. Well, in the show notes, we'll have the links to Latinx in Publishing and to your imprint as well, so folks can learn more. The final question for you is the one I always ask, the final question, which is, who's your favorite disruptor in history?
Okay.
Dead or alive?
Okay, so I feel like that's gotta be Pura Belpre, who was the first Puerto Rican librarian in New York City's public library system. And she did a little bit of what I was just talking about, where she couldn't find bilingual books or books written in Spanish for her patrons. And so she wrote some. And she also didn't see a place for bilingual storytelling. So she created that space. She created that kind of programming and took it all over New York City. She started in Harlem, but she did a lot of outreach in the Bronx and the Lower East Side. And really, she helped a whole generation of Spanish-speaking and bilingual kids become readers. And that's huge. So for me, she's one of the disruptors that I think about a lot.
It's beautiful. Great choice. Well, thank you for fighting the good fight and for helping to spearhead what I think will be a very important organization moving forward. And we look forward to having more folks from your community on Disruptor. And I want to thank you for taking the time for speaking to us today. It's been great.
Thank you for shining a spotlight on us.
Today's episode of Disruptor was brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book.
For show notes and videos, go to disruptcast.online. And to start a disruption of your own, visit writingblueprints.com to discover the most innovative and coolest way ever to write a great book. We'll be back next week. Until then, go forth and disrupt.